Thank you very much, Yang, for those kind words. I hope farewell doesn't mean I can't come back, because it's really wonderful to be back at IFPRI. You treat me so well every time I come, and I'm wondering why I ever left. But I'm sure I could give you a good reason for that, namely that no Director General can be here for more than 10 years, and I did 10 years, and that was it. It's wonderful to be back. I have made a few good decisions in my tenure as director of IFPRI, and one was to hire the current director, but I have hired several others who are in this room today, and I am yet to make the first mistake. We had a tremendous staff while I was here, and fortunately some are still with IFPRI, and many new ones are, I'm sure, just as qualified as the one I was able to hire and work with. So I'm going to talk over the next, was it 45 minutes you said? 35 minutes about just some highlights from a study that we have virtually completed. And by we, I'm talking about what you see on the screens. Researchers from 14 developing countries, from the EU, from the US. It's a collaborative arrangement with the UNU wider and the University of Copenhagen and Cornell, with funding from the Gates Foundation. There are several people who are associated one way or the other with IFPRI involved in this study. I'm not going to list them because I'm bound to leave one or two out, but simply say there was no formal collaborative arrangement with IFPRI, but IFPRI has its fingerprints in much of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about those links that you see on this slide. I'm going to say very little about the global food crisis or the price increases, because IFPRI has done a lot of work on that, and so have others. So I'm just going to, that's kind of going to be my starting point. I'm going to talk a bit about price transmission. I'm going to talk about policy responses, and then I'm going to end with what we were really trying to do in this project, namely to understand why policymakers made the decisions that they made in those 14 countries, and trying to draw some general lessons out of that those country studies. We have syntheses, papers, all of this is on the web, available at the UNU wider website, where you can go and take a look at the papers and the briefs. The book is not out yet. Books take a long time, but there will eventually be a book. So let me just very briefly refer to what I think everybody in this room knows, namely we had some food price increases at the global market beginning about 10 years ago, and they really took off about 5 years ago, after which the prices came down. But that graph, which is from FAO, is well known, I think, to all of you. What concerns me more than anything is the increasing fluctuations, the price volatility that we see, not only globally, but in many countries as well. I think that's what we should really be worried about for the future, not so much the long-term trends in real food prices, because I happen to think that that trend, if it's going to be up, which I doubt, it's not going to be up by very much. The issue, it seems to me, is volatility, and how poor people can cope. We call it resilience, or we can call it whatever you like, coping mechanisms. That, it seems to me, is one of the critical issues. So let me talk about price transmission. Here you see a situation where there was a very high degree of price transmission from the world market to the national markets. In South Africa and Bangladesh, they have very close links to the international market for two quite different reasons, but nevertheless, the domestic prices pretty much followed what happened in the world market. In China and India, that did not happen, not because China and India are not well linked to the global market, but because the governments decided to put in place trade policies that would pretty much, if not eliminate, at least reduce the price transmission dramatically. And you can see if you look at these, I'm not going to point because then it will take too long, and Schengen is going to pull me away from here. But if you look at the steeply increasing rice price, that's from the global market, and you look at China and India, and not much happened. And that's precisely because the governments didn't want much to happen for reasons I'll come back to. And then we have several countries that are not very closely linked to the world market, and within which there were national factors that were a lot more important in influencing food prices than what happened in the global market. And this is one of the findings from this study, that while at the international level we were talking about these global food price fluctuations, but in fact what was happening at some of the national levels in some of the countries was even more important, much more important. It wasn't anything new. We've seen droughts before, we've seen market fluctuations before in many of those countries, but it wasn't until the world market showed these dramatic price fluctuations that the international community started paying attention. This is a slide from Nick Minot's work, where he compares the transmission across a number of countries, and obviously if you look at the bottom where the transmission is more than 100%, what it really means that the national factors were so much more important than the international ones. This is from IFPRI's annual Global Food Policy Report, which you will, I'm sure, recognize, and it shows what FAO suggested was happening, and then subsequently, after they looked at the evidence, it shows how they changed those estimates. Now, imagine you're a policymaker and you're looking at that tip that you see, and I am going to point at that right here. This is what the policymaker was looking at the time. And this is what the policymaker, if he reads the IFPRI and the FAO report, will be looking at now. Extremely different. How are you going to make evidence-based decisions on the basis of data that are so widely different? When this spike was shown by FAO, some of us were asking whether they had the evidence. Well, they didn't. It's a wonderful advocacy tool, but it is an extremely dangerous thing to do, because people do pay attention to reputable organizations like FAO and certainly IFPRI. So the reason I'm showing you this slide right here is I think the only real explanation I can give for this peak, which of course turned out to be fiction, is that somehow price transmission wasn't considered. So if the global price went up by 300% as it did for rice over a short period of time, then rice prices everywhere would go up by 300%, which of course is just not true. A couple of other things on price transmission. This shows the real food price indices in the European Union and the world market price. And what you see, again, the yellow one, you see this dramatic increase in the world market, and not much increase in the producer index in the EU, and virtually no increase in the consumer price index in the EU. In the worst case, probably the consumers were paying 5% more for their food, and there are a number of reasons for that. But the most important one, of course, is that in the EU, we're really not paying for the food, we're paying for everything else that's added to the food. And that's why when the EU consumers were complaining about these dramatic price increases, it isn't entirely clear what they were complaining about. Now, the reason why the producer prices in the EU, the price index, didn't go up as much as the international price index is primarily the different composition of the commodities in the index. Because if we take cereal prices in the EU and cereal prices in the global market, you see a very high you see a very high transmission as shown in this slide. So we have to be real careful as to what does this index really represent. This is just to drive home the point. This shows the coefficient of variance for the various price series, and you see there was a very high coefficient of variance in the cereal prices, both in the EU and in the world market, whereas if you go all the way to your left, you see there was virtually no variation in the consumer price. It's just another way of showing what I showed you a few minutes ago. Another very interesting highlight is the question of to what extent did biofuel policy in the EU influence the global food prices. And there's a lot written about this, including by IFPRI. And if you look at this slide, it doesn't look like there's much relationship between the corn price, or the maize price if you like, and ethanol. They seem, the maize price, the corn price doesn't really vary much, ethanol price is going up. That was up until towards the end of 2006. This is what happened afterwards. A very high correlation. Why? Primarily for three reasons. One is a blending mandate which was introduced in the US. Secondly, subsidies, and eventually one canceled out the other. And third, that the refinement, the construction of refineries finally came on. There was a tremendous increase in the capacity to refine ethanol. So what you're seeing here is probably what you'll be seeing in the future. Let me now move to policy responses and the policy process. There were basically two things that these case study countries did. They either tried to slow down the domestic food price increase and the volatility, as we've seen in, for example, China and India, or they tried to let the price signals work and then compensate the losers. Let me just very quickly run through what policies we found for slowing down the domestic increase in prices and volatility. Trade policies, I mentioned already China and India, export bans, removal of import tariffs, for example, would tend to smooth out the international price changes. Several countries tried direct price control. The price shall be this. They all failed. Yes, that's what we learned in Economics 101. We knew they would fail, but nevertheless, it was tried and it failed. One more piece of evidence. Many of the countries removed taxes, value-added taxes on food, in order to protect the consumers, and others released grain from the reserves, if they had any, again to keep prices low. And then there were some production expansions. And that was primarily, as I'll talk about later, short-term interventions, fertilizer subsidies. No real increase in agricultural research. Who cares about agricultural research that would have an impact 10, 20 years from now? I'm sorry, I'm not in the office, I'm not in power by that time. I want fertilizer subsidies because I can see some effect next year. Then the other set of policies, and there were other policies, but those were the key ones. The other set of policies was to reduce the negative impact on the losers, or that's not the way to put it, on selected groups of losers. And that's an important difference, and I'll show that in a few minutes. Targeted cash transfers. Some countries like Brazil, South Africa, had those transfer programs in place. They just added more resources. Targeted and untargeted food subsidies. And this is where the distinction between losers and selected groups of losers is very important. Because virtually all of the social programs, whether they were food subsidies, cash transfers, conditional or not conditional, were focused on the urban lower middle class in countries where most of the poverty is in rural areas. Now, I think we can all figure out why that is. If not, we can ask a policy. No, we can't. They won't tell you the truth necessarily. But clearly, there was a very strong urban bias. And as I'll expand on a little later, that was for good reasons, because they were looking for a goal that was different from poverty alleviation, namely a goal of government approval. They increased public sector wages in a few countries. So let's look at the process, and I'm sorry for going so fast, but I know Schengen, when he says 35 minutes, he means no more than 45, so, so I'm going real fast here. Many of these policies were ad hoc, not in China, not in India. They knew what they were doing. But in many other countries, they kept delaying the action. In Nigeria, they spent very long time discussing whether there was a food crisis or not. And when they agreed that there probably was, then the next question was, does that matter for Nigeria? And I'm not necessarily picking on one country, because I can give you examples from others as well. So this was not a very well organized kind of response. The responses had very high fiscal costs because of revenue losses. They put in place export bans. They reduced or eliminated import tariffs. They eliminated the value-added taxes. And the other cost factor, of course, was the program cost, as they add more resources to various kinds of transfer programs. And here's one of the real important things, which we didn't have to do the study to figure out. When governments interfere with the price signals, as they did in virtually every country, except for South Africa and to some extent Brazil, they are in fact telling producers to produce less than they otherwise would if they would leave the price be. And they're telling the consumer to consume more than they otherwise would. So interfering in the price signal would have the exact opposite effect of what presumably the government would like to see happen. So the crisis, in a sense, became wider. Yes, there were a number of other goals, and we'll get to that, and they achieved some of those goals. Very poor targeting of the transfer programs. Some of those that poor targeting was by design. As I mentioned earlier, it was not targeted on the rural poor because they were not a threat to the government. It was targeted on the lower income, the lower middle income urban people, because they were the real threat to the government. They were the ones who either went to the street or paid somebody to go to the street and smash some cars and windows and burn a few things and so on. So the transfer programs, the safety nets, were very poorly targeted if your goal is to target to those that lost the most, or those for which the consequences of losing would be most severe, namely the poorest of the poor. Food and fertilizer subsidies, as I mentioned, those were short-term interventions. We have lots of indications of corruption, but it was very difficult for the country authors to really get into that and still continue to live in their country. So we have some indications, but we really don't have the kind of evidence that I was hoping we could get. Cross-border trading meant that some of the trade policies really didn't have an effect, had very little effect. Yeah, you can ban your formal export, but a lot of stuff may be flowing across the border depending on which country you're looking at. Selective enforcement of export bans. You're my friend, so you can get some of my wheat. I don't particularly like you, so I have a ban as far as you're concerned. There was quite a bit of that going on. India certainly takes the price for pursuing those kinds of policies. Untimely government procurement. Some of the governments, when the prices were going up, got nervous, thinking that the prices were going to continue to go up. And in fact, when they were reading the international media, you can't blame them, because that's what most of the media said. This price is going to go up and up and up, and it's never come down. That was before it came down. Then when it came down, the media said nothing. So some of the governments actually went into the market and bought grain to put in reserve, and thereby pushing up the prices even more. Shows the importance of good information. Imagine what the situation would have been like without IFPRI. At least IFPRI provided a lot of good information which policymakers could use. Political economy issues, priority number 1, poverty reduction? No, of course not. Protecting government legitimacy is priority number 1, number 2, and number 3. Whatever it takes, including breaking all your international agreements if that is necessary. It's called beggar thy neighbor. Not sure where it probably comes from the Bible or someplace, but in any case, if they had to pass on the consequences to the rest of the world, so be it. And again, India did quite a bit of that. China did some of that. But most of the other countries tried, but many of them were too small to have much of an impact. Brazil and South Africa did not. The government speaks with one voice. We know that. At least we assume that when we do policy analysis in the old-fashioned way. Furthermore, they just pursue efficiency goals. So we just tell them what's most efficient, and that's what's going to get done. Well, we know, those of us who've been in food policy for a long time know that's not the case. We found a number of situations where individual units of a particular government worked cross-purpose. And in some countries, they were actually able to implement policies, interventions that canceled each other out or pulled in 2 different directions. There was quite a bit of that. And again, all of the details are in the papers. There was very little policy innovation taking place. Governments looked back on what they had done in the last crisis. They looked at what they had. They could just add to it. Very little innovation. It was kind of more of the same, or they dug up something that they had used a few years back. The relative power stakeholders, stakeholder groups varied tremendously. In some countries, the millers of wheat, for example, were very important. In other cases, the producer associations were very important. In some cases, the Ministry of Finance made most of the decisions. There was a tremendous difference both within the government and across society. And that, of course, is the real key political economy issue. And we got lots of evidence in the papers. There's a clear increasing urban bias. I already referred to that, I believe, once or twice. But when push comes to shove, the governments in all of these countries would protect those urban groups that were threatening the government. They paid a lot of lip service to smallholders, but they did nothing for them. Whatever was done for agriculture was done for the large commercial farms. There was a mutual mistrust between government and the private sector. This is important because obviously economic development and poverty alleviation has to be based on the private sector. There's no other way that I'm aware of where we can get the kind of economic growth and poverty alleviation using exclusively the public sector. Some countries are trying, but they're not doing very well. So the fact that there's such a mistrust, which results in hoarding, in speculation, in governments not issuing decrees until 10 minutes before they have to take effect, the uncertainty created by the private sector and the private sector's response to that, and I'm not saying one is more guilty than the other, I'm just saying that is making economic development and poverty alleviation extremely difficult. During the period of when governments were in serious financial trouble and there was a need for adjustment, many of the development agencies, the international agencies, would kind of tell governments what to do, or at least strongly suggest that if they didn't do what they were told, something nasty would happen to them. That we didn't find here. When the crisis hit and governments decided to do something, the foreign agencies supported what the governments wanted to do, rather than go in and say, all right, government, that's the wrong thing, you should do this, which they did in structural adjustment to a considerable extent. That, I thought, was a very interesting finding. Now, it's only for 14 countries, and maybe the other 180-some countries do something different, but I don't think so. I think there was a deliberate decision made by these agencies, including the big ones, not to mess it up for the government, but to support them in what they were proposing to do. Now, I suspect that's a good thing. At least it seems to be a step in the direction that at least we're arguing the world should move. So finally, the lessons for development assistance. Do not assume unitary government decision-making process. It doesn't exist in Washington, D.C., and it doesn't exist in any of the countries that we looked at. Expect a strong urban bias. I already made that point. Expect a strong bias in favor of large-scale farming, and don't get fooled by the rhetoric, because the rhetoric to support and promote smallholders and use smallholders as a foundation for agricultural and economic development is usually not translated into action in those countries that we looked at. Now, we were looking at a short-term crisis, and it may well be that point 4 up there is less relevant if you're looking at a long-term structural change in an economy. But at least what we found was that smallholders were kind of left to their own, or they were used as an excuse for keeping prices low, because the argument was most smallholders are net buyers of food, therefore we should keep food prices low, which was a wonderful thing for the urban lower middle class people that the government really wanted to help. It was a wonderful excuse, but it was a lousy excuse, because if you keep those prices low, these smallholders are going to continue to be net buyers of food. If you want to help them become net sellers of food, you can't continue to squeeze them by keeping the prices so extremely low, or at least lower than they would otherwise be. My final point, Shenyan, relates to the mutual distrust between public and private sector. It is, I think, a very important hindrance to getting some effective economic growth and poverty alleviation, certainly in the countries that we looked at. This is where you can find all of the papers, all of the briefs. This may be more than you want to copy down, but if you go to the UNU WIDER website, WIDER, and go into research, you will find this project, and that's where all the material is. Eventually there will be a book, probably in whenever, a year and a half. Thank you for reminding me. There is one brief out on the table, unless you already picked it up, and at the bottom of that brief you see the reference that I'm showing here. So with that, Schengen, I thank you for your patience. Did I take more than 35 minutes?
That was right. Great.